"Criminal!" they shouted in front of my son. He stood frozen, his eyes brimming with tears, unable to understand why his father was being treated like a monster. What no one imagined was that shortly after, I would be the only one capable of saving that entire school. My name is Michael, and before all this happened, before being called a criminal in front of my own son, I was just a man trying to live an ordinary life. I grew up in a simple neighborhood, surrounded by hard-working people, but also by a lot of temptation. From an early age, I learned that the world could be cruel to those who didn't have much to offer. I wanted more. I wanted to prove I could build a decent life. But life has a strange way of testing us, and in my case, I ended up choosing the wrong path. Before I ended up behind bars, my life was a mix of struggle and frustration. I worked construction, spending all day on scaffolding, mixing cement, carrying blocks, sweating in the sun. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest. I'd come home tired, but when I saw my son smile running toward me, it all seemed worth it. He was always my reason, the only reason I kept going. My wife had already left me by then. The weight of my choices, the financial problems, the endless arguments ended up eroding what little was left of our relationship. So it was just me and my boy. He was the one who gave me strength when the whole world seemed to conspire against me. But the truth is, the pressure of supporting everything alone was too much. I started getting involved in things I shouldn't have. A little side hustle here, a little side hustle there. Small jobs that promised quick cash. At first it seemed innocent, just driving a car, delivering a box, turning a blind eye to certain things. But once you step onto that path, there's no way out without paying the price. And I did. Prison was a hell I'll never forget. Inside, you stop being a person with a name and become just a number. Michael no longer existed, just another inmate in the system. The bad food, the suspicious looks, the constant violence. But worse than all of that was the absence. Every night I lay in my cold bed, I thought of my son sleeping without his father. It slowly killed me. And yet I learned a lot there. I discovered who I truly was when I had nothing to hide. I met men who, like me, had made mistakes, but who also dreamed of a second chance. I made promises to myself. If I ever had the opportunity to leave, I would change. I would give my son the father he deserved. The day of my parole was like breathing after years underwater. I remember the feeling of walking down the street with the sky open above me. I was a free man, but I also knew that the outside world doesn't forget. No matter how long you spend paying for your mistakes, there will always be someone ready to remind you of who you were. Returning to society was much harder than I imagined. Finding a job, nearly impossible. Every time I showed up for an interview, the question would come, "Do you have a criminal record?" I'd answer truthfully, and I'd see the interviewer's expression change. The position would disappear instantly. Some didn't even hide their contempt. So once again, it was my son who kept me going. He was a little older now, but he still had that twinkle in his eye when he spoke to me. "Dad, you're home now. That's what matters." I knew I couldn't let him down again. It was in this context that I decided to become more involved in his life. I attended school meetings and tried to be present in every detail. I no longer wanted to be just a dad who showed up occasionally. I wanted to be constant, to be seen, to be a real part of his life. But society doesn't forgive easily. I could have harbored in my heart all the desire to change. I could even have sworn never to get into trouble again. But for many people, I never stopped being a criminal. And that's exactly what was revealed at the meeting where it all happened. That day, I woke up early, put on my best shirt, fixed my hair, and made sure to hold my son's hand as we walked into school. I wanted him to be proud of me. I wanted to show everyone that I was just a father, like any other, concerned about his child's future. But what happened next showed me that the scars of the past are harder to erase than I imagined. I'll never forget that day. It was just another parent-teacher conference at my son's school. For most families, it was a simple, even banal occasion. But for me, It was a huge moment. It was a chance to show him and myself that I was there, present, involved, and interested. I woke up early that morning. I spent the night awake, anxious. I carefully chose my outfit, a blue shirt I still had from my construction days. It was a little worn, but it was the best I had. It's funny how small details seem so huge when you carry the weight of a past that never leaves you. On the way to school, my son held my hand tightly. He didn't know my insecurities. He had no idea how fast my heart was pounding. To him, I was just his dad, and that gave me strength. I took a deep breath and thought, today will be different. Today, no one will look at me as if I were a stranger. We entered the room where the meeting would take place. Several parents were already seated, chatting in groups. Some teachers were arranging papers on the table. I tried to smile, tried to blend in, but I immediately noticed the stares. The kind of stare that doesn't need words to express itself. What is this guy doing here? I sat next to my son, trying to ignore him. He seemed happy, proud to have me there. That little detail was enough for me. The teacher began talking about the children's performance, school projects, and the importance of parental involvement. I struggled to pay attention, trying not to seem out of place, until it happened. In the middle of the meeting, a mother, I remember her well, tall, with her hair tied back, always with her posture straight as if she were better than everyone else, raised her hand and asked to speak. At first, I thought she was going to talk about some class problem, but no, she looked directly at me, and her voice, thick with contempt, said, "I think it's absurd to allow ex-convict participate in these meetings. What example does this set for our children?" The silence fell like a blow. All eyes turned to me. I felt my face heat up. My son beside me widened his eyes. He didn't know how to respond, didn't understand how someone could say that out loud, in front of everyone. I tried to remain calm. I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could say anything, another parent murmured, "That's right, I've heard. He got arrested, didn't he?" And then came the scream that tore me apart. A voice from the background, I don't even remember who it was. I only remember the words, like an echo that never left my head. "Criminal!" The sound of the word spread through the room like wildfire. Some snickered, others just looked away as if I were invisible. But my son was paralyzed. I looked at him and saw the tears welling up, glistening against the innocent gaze that until then had only known his father as someone trying to be better. From that moment on, the meeting lost all meaning. The professor tried to return to the topic, urging calm, but it was too late. The wound had been opened, and everyone had seen it. I wanted to get up and run away, but I couldn't. If I ran, I'd be confirming what they were saying. So I sat there, my chest burning, holding my son's hand as if it were the only thing keeping me going. Inside, I screamed, wanting to say that I had paid for my mistakes, that I was trying, that no one had the right to reduce me to the worst moment of my life. But outwardly, I could only remain silent. The humiliation didn't end with the meeting. In the days that followed, whispers spread throughout the school. I became the talk of the hallways, a ghost everyone knew was there but no one wanted near. My son began to feel the weight too. Some classmates began calling him the gangster's son. He would come home quieter, more withdrawn, as if carrying a shame that wasn't his alone. Seeing this destroyed me. I always knew my past would haunt me, but I never imagined it would resonate like this. The injustice was unbearable. I could handle people's contempt, but seeing my son suffer because of me was too much. Sometimes I found myself wondering if that mother or father who yelled even realized what they'd done. Maybe for them, it was just a moment, just a phrase thrown into the wind. But for me, it was a scar that never fully healed. And for my son, it was the first time he saw the world pointing the finger at his father. That night, after the meeting, I lay in bed and couldn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling and heard the word echoing, "Criminal, criminal, criminal." It was as if I was still inside a cell, as if I had never left. And the worst part was knowing that, even on the outside, he was still a prisoner, not of iron bars, but of people's opinions. That was my first real wound in the world after prison. Not a wound on my body, but on my soul. An open wound right in front of my son, who until then believed I was just his father, the hero who had come home. After that meeting, nothing was the same. The word criminal clung to me like a shadow I couldn't shake. But the worst part wasn't what they said. It was the way it spread, as if it had been a definitive sentence. The school, which was supposed to be a safe place for my son, became a constant judgment ground. In the days that followed, I still tried to feign normalcy. I'd walk my son to the gate, kiss him on the head and say, "Go on, son, do your best." But I could see it. The stares of the other parents, always crossing, always suspicious. Some crossed their arms when they saw me. Others moved to the other sidewalk as if I were contagious. No one needed to say anything else. Their silence spoke volumes. And my son, he began to feel this cruelly. At first, it was just subtle comments. "Don't let him come play here. His mother doesn't like his father." Then came the nicknames. I could hear, even from afar, some boys shouting, "Look, there's the bandit's son!" And seeing my boy, who was once happy and full of energy, now lower his head and pretend he didn't hear. That was a torture I wouldn't wish on anyone. I tried to talk to him at home. I'd ask, "Is everything okay, son?" He'd reply with a fragile smile, "Yes, Dad." But I could see in his eyes that he wasn't. I knew the weight he carried. He hadn't done anything wrong, but the world was already teaching him the price of having my last name. One day, I received a call from the school administration. The principal asked me to come in. When I arrived, she was serious, her tone a mix of politeness and distance. She said, "Mr. Michael, some parents have expressed concern about your frequent presence at school." I asked what that meant exactly. She looked away and replied, "Perhaps it would be better to maintain a more discreet posture to avoid conflict." At that moment I understood. They didn't want me to be present in my son's school life. They wanted me to remain hidden, as if I were a stain that could sully the environment. And the irony was cruel. The same society that demands that parents be present was telling me I had no right to be. The conflict didn't end there. I needed a job. I needed to support my family. But in every interview, the past came knocking first. I handed in my resume, smiled and answered questions, but when it came time to talk about my background, the air changed. The employer's smile disappeared, and the interview became an empty formality. There was one specific incident I've never forgotten. I landed a job at a maintenance company. I took the tests, passed, and even worked my first day. On the second, they called me into the supervisor's office. He said, "Michael, you're good, but we've had some calls. Parents of students at this school have called. They said they're uncomfortable with you working so close to children." I was silent. It was as if the walls were closing in. I asked if I had done something wrong, and he replied, "No, but we need to maintain the company's image." I was fired right then and there, not for what I was doing now, but for what I had been. And all the while my son watched everything. He saw the effort I was making, he saw the doors closing, and I think a mixture of pity and confusion grew inside him. A child shouldn't have to carry that kind of burden. I tried to stay calm, tried not to break down in front of him. But alone at night, sitting at the kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee, I felt the crushing weight of injustice. I thought, is it worth fighting for? Will I ever stop being a prisoner of my past? And there were even worse moments. Moments when I felt anger rising inside me, anger at those who judged me, anger at those who treated me as if I were less than human. I remembered every day behind bars, every promise I made not to return to that place. But at the same time, I felt the temptation to give up, to abandon everything, to assume the role they said I was. It was like living trapped in two wars, one against the world, which didn't accept me, and another against myself, trying not to fall back into the same mistakes. One time, my son came home from school with his eyes swollen from crying. He threw himself on the couch and said, "Dad, why don't they like you? You're not bad." That broke me. I didn't know what to say. How do I explain to a child that society doesn't forgive? How do I tell him that for many people, I'll never stop being a criminal no matter how much I change? I just hugged him tightly and said, "Son, sometimes people don't understand, but we don't need to prove anything to them. We just need to prove it to ourselves." But inside, I didn't believe those words. The conflict deepened every day. It was like being in a ring, being beaten relentlessly with no right to defend myself. I tried to resist, tried to smile at my son, but I felt myself being pushed further and further down. And it was in this abyss that I began to realize, if I didn't find a way out, if I didn't discover a way to rise, it wouldn't just be me who would lose. My son would also be swallowed by this weight, and this thought haunted me more than any prison cell. There comes a point when the pressure becomes unbearable, and I've reached that exact point. I always thought I could endure anything: insults, closed doors, looks of contempt. After all, I'd already endured years behind bars. I'd seen what it's like to live at rock bottom. But I discovered that the real hell isn't in the iron bars, but in people's eyes when they look at you like you're trash. After that series of humiliations, I found myself in a state I never imagined. Every morning, getting out of bed was a struggle. I looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the man there. I asked myself, is it really worth continuing? Will I ever be able to be more than this mark I carry? My son was the only reason I still had a breath, but even then, the weight of my past began to crush me. He, once a happy boy, became increasingly silent. The games diminished. The smiles became rare. School, which should have been a place of learning, became an arena of pain for him. I could see in his eyes that he was tired. It wasn't fair. He wasn't to blame for anything, but he was paying the price along with me. The trigger came on a Friday afternoon. I had gone to pick up my son from school. While waiting at the gate, I heard whispers again. Two mothers were near me, and one of them said loudly, without even trying to hide it, "I don't know how they let a guy like that get near children." The other replied, "He should be locked up again. People like that don't change." My son heard. I saw his shoulders slump, saw the shame on his face. In that moment, I felt like the whole world had collapsed around me. It wasn't about me anymore. It was about him. They were destroying my boy's childhood, and I didn't know how to protect him. When we got home, he locked himself in his room. I stood outside, begging him to open the door, but he wouldn't. Hours later, when he came out, his eyes were red from crying. He sat on the couch and asked, almost whispering, "Dad, would it be better if you didn't go to school anymore?" Those words pierced me like a knife. My own son, the reason I fought, was asking me to disappear. Not because he didn't love me, but because he was tired of suffering. At that moment, I broke down. I spent the entire night pacing the house. I couldn't sleep, couldn't think of anything but a suffocating sense of failure. I had promised myself, way back then, that I would never be a source of shame to him again. But despite all my efforts, that's exactly what I was becoming. I sat in the kitchen, in the wee hours of the morning, with an empty glass in front of me. The silence was heavy. I found myself thinking things that frightened me. I thought about disappearing. I thought maybe it would be better for him if I weren't here anymore. If I didn't exist, he wouldn't have to carry the weight of my past. He could grow up free, without hearing whispers, without feeling shame. This thought gnawed at me. I didn't want to give up, but the pain was so great that there seemed no escape. I looked at the clock and watched the hours pass, waiting for some answer to come, but all that came was the echo of that word, criminal. I was no longer Michael, his father. I was just the label everyone repeated. The next day, I tried to carry on as normal. I made coffee and set his plate on the table. But the tension was there, silent, like a wall between us. He avoided looking me in the eye, and it destroyed me. I had lost his spark. And it was at that point that I realized I was sinking. I no longer had the energy to look for work. I no longer had the strength to face people. I began avoiding leaving the house, avoiding meetings, even avoiding my own neighbors. It was as if I were shrinking, slowly disappearing. I was on the verge of giving up on everything. There was a night when I sat on the porch, looking out at the empty street. The moon was high, and I kept thinking, is there anywhere in the world where I won't be judged by my past? Is there any real chance of starting over? But no answers came. Only silence came, heavy, suffocating. The breakup wasn't a one-time event. It was a slow process, a continuous wear and tear, until I could no longer recognize myself. The Michael who dreamed of being a present father was disappearing, replaced by a tired, broken man who only wanted to escape his own shadow. And it was at that rock bottom that I realized, if something didn't happen soon, I wouldn't have the strength to carry on. I wasn't just losing my battle against the world, I was losing the battle against myself. When everything seemed too dark, life decided to show me there was still a glimmer of light. It wasn't a grand event, nor a movie scene with triumphant music. It was something small, intimate, that entered my life like a quiet conversation that warms my chest until it ignites again. Hope came disguised as a simple gesture, and it was enough to keep me from sinking completely. The morning everything began to change. I hadn't slept well for days. The house felt smaller, the air heavier. My son's face was still grim. School remained hostile. I'd get up, clock in, make coffee, and the rest of the day was a mechanical attempt to survive. I didn't believe in turnarounds. I believed only in hard work and suffering in silence, until he walked through the door. The mailman placed a thick envelope on my lap, with no clear return address. I opened it calmly, as if unwilling to be disappointed again, and found a handwritten letter. The writing was firm, a little crooked, but legible. I couldn't remember the name at the end. Cynthia Allen Parkey read each line, as if it were an instruction to breathe again. Allen said he'd participated in a prison rehabilitation project years ago, and that, upon hearing my name by chance in a conversation, he'd felt the need to write. He said he also had a son, that he'd lost a lot of time as a young man due to bad choices, and that after all that, he'd also found a way to start over, by working with job training and volunteering at community centers. He said he'd read on a bulletin board at the local church, by chance, that I was looking for a job and that he wanted to offer me a reference and a place to start as a volunteer assistant at the community center where he worked. Nothing grand. Initially it would be sweeping, organizing materials, and helping with minor renovations. But it was a start. That letter was like a hand extended across a cliff. In an instant, all the stories of closed doors I'd been carrying, the interviews that turned into excuses, the eyes that avoided mine, seemed less definitive. Not because a man had given me the solution, but because someone believed I could still do something useful. Someone else's belief, however simple, gave me a breather. I met Alan at the community center the following Saturday. He greeted me with a firm handshake and a smile that held no mercy. I sensed right away that there would be no humiliating charity there, just work and opportunity. He introduced me to the routine, the tools, the people who frequented the center, teachers who provided tutoring, mothers who took sewing classes, teenagers who found an alternative in sports. Alan didn't ask more about my past than necessary. He asked about my skills and what I wanted to build. The first day was difficult, sweeping, carrying boxes, painting walls, fixing a squeaky door. But I left with dirty hands and a lighter heart. No one asked if I was a criminal. Anyone who saw me there saw me as someone who arrived early, did the job right, and smiled when necessary. It was the first time in a long time that work and dignity went hand in hand again in my life, and what struck me most was my son's reaction. At first, he was embarrassed that I participated in public activities, as he called them. Then he began to see me differently. One afternoon, with him, we went downtown to pick up some school supplies. He noticed the kids in extra classes, the volunteers, and pulled me by the hand with quiet pride. "Look, Dad, you're helping out here," he said, his voice low, as if pointing out something precious. It wasn't just a compliment, it was a delicate reparation. He was slowly restoring to me the image of someone who made a difference. There, I also encountered other stories similar to mine. There was a man who had been released from prison and now taught carpentry, a woman who had served time and was leading cooking workshops for mothers. No one there wanted to erase the past, but everyone wanted to prove that the future could be different when someone offered the opportunity. This community of new beginnings gave me something I hadn't felt in years: belonging. I began to see myself as part of something bigger than my flaws. A sign of hope also came from other unexpected sources. A teacher at the center, upon learning that I enjoyed working with my hands, offered me a basic electrical course. He said perhaps I could specialize and get a better job. I eagerly accepted. In the classes, I learned not only how to work with wires and circuit breakers, but also how to rebuild my self-confidence. Each small victory, a circuit that worked, a light bulb that turned on, was a boost to my self-esteem. As the weeks passed, I realized that hope didn't appear on its own. It required me to take steps, however small. It required me to accept help, to learn to ask for it when before I'd only cowered in shame. And most importantly, it required someone to believe in me without insisting on beating me back with past mistakes. Alan and the people at the center didn't try to diminish what I'd experienced. They simply gave me the space to rewrite what I could be. There were still bad days. People still whispered as I walked by, and my son still faced gossip at school. The wound didn't heal overnight, but at that point, for the first time in a long time, I felt I had tools to deal with the pain. It was as if I'd lifted a heavy backpack from my back, and even with scars, I could walk lighter. There was one specific moment that will never leave my memory. I was working on a community effort to renovate the school playground, helping to install the benches, when a teacher who had previously looked at me with disdain arrived. She saw my dedication, saw my sweat, and approached me. She said nothing about the past. Instead, she blurted out a sincere "thank you" for the help. It was a small gesture, perhaps a shy remark on her part, but for me it was huge. It was society, slowly, beginning to remember that people can change. The hope I found in that center wasn't an empty promise. It was an invitation to rebuild step by step. And most importantly, it gave me back something I thought I'd lost forever: the ability to believe in myself again. I returned home exhausted, but with a good kind of exhaustion. My son recognized me more often in the eyes again, and I began to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance to turn the page. That's how, when life would throw another test our way, one that would require courage and determination, I would no longer arrive so empty. I had a foundation, however small. I had hands that knew how to work, a place that accepted me, and a boy who was beginning to smile again. The spark was lit. I just didn't yet know how brightly it would have to burn to become a flame. The turning point didn't come like a bolt of lightning. It was more like the slow lightning after a seemingly endless storm. I'd been working at the community center for months, and my presence there had left small but visible marks. Repaired benches, painted walls, a court that had once been a pile of rubble and now served as a training ground for children. I wasn't seeking applause. I just wanted to be useful, and that usefulness, little by little, began to speak for itself. It was on a Saturday morning, when we were organizing a community effort to renovate the school library, that I first noticed a different look coming from those who had previously treated me with disdain. There was a group of parents helping, familiar faces, some who ignored me during ceremonies, others who whispered in the hallways. On the other side, I saw the mother who had once yelled at me not to attend the meetings. She was there, lifting bags of cement, sweating in the sun, her brow furrowed. I also saw the supervisor from the maintenance company who had fired me, his hands dirty, coordinating a team. No one stood idly by, waiting for someone else to fix everything. Everyone did their part. Amidst the organized chaos, the school principal approached me. I remember my heart pounding, out of fear, out of anticipation. I couldn't tell. She looked at the floor for a moment and then said bluntly, "Michael, thank you. Your help has been invaluable." It was simple, straightforward. But for me, it had the force of a verdict against the accusations that had plagued me. There was no applause or speeches. There was practical recognition. The director asked me to lead the group that would reorganize the collection, delegated tasks, and treated me as a partner. It was the first time in a long time that I didn't feel the weight of the label when I was being effective. From then on, things began to change in ways I hadn't expected. Some parents who had previously avoided greeting me began asking me for advice on small home improvements. The supervisor who had fired me looked at me with new eyes when he saw that I knew how to handle tools and that I calmly organized teams. In situations where I'd previously been excluded, direct requests now arose. "Can you stay with this group? Can you check that outlet? Help us put up the shelves?" It wasn't hypocrisy. It was, above all, pragmatism. When someone needs to solve a problem, the past loses some of its luster and competence speaks louder. But there was something beyond pragmatism. I felt my dignity, which had been trampled so many times, was being put back in its place, and that gave me purpose. One incident marked this irreversible change. During a rainy afternoon, a short circuit in the old electrical system caused a small fire in the school kitchen. Not dangerous yet, thanks to the quickness of a staff member who extinguished the flames with a fire extinguisher. But the incident exposed the fragility of the school's infrastructure. The principal called an extraordinary meeting with parents to discuss urgent improvements. Some began to complain, others pointed fingers. The tension could have boiled over old feuds, but something different happened. I, who until recently wouldn't have even had a voice in such a conversation, stood up and spoke calmly. I explained what I'd seen at the community center about maintenance, proposed a practical plan of action, checking the wiring, replacing circuit breakers, installing fire extinguishers, and a preventative maintenance schedule. I didn't talk about my past. I didn't need to. I presented a roadmap, numbers, simple budgets, and volunteers who could help. My speech was technical, objective, no drama. When I finished, I noticed that many there looked at me in surprise. This wasn't the same man who'd elicited ridicule. This was someone who knew how to solve problems. Some parents who had previously avoided me were the first to volunteer to raise funds. The company's supervisor, who was present, promised to donate materials. The director approved the plan and asked me to coordinate its implementation. I felt the weight of responsibility, but also a spark of pride. That meant trust. And trust, once established, changes relationships. After that day, my role at school changed. Not because I had erased the past, but because the community began to see that I could transform my knowledge into service. My actions began to speak louder than my old words. And people, seeing concrete results, began to approach me with a curiosity that wasn't hostile. It was interested. The change also had an intimate side. My son began to look at me with something new, respect. He saw me coordinating volunteers, explaining tasks, arriving early and leaving late. One day, when work was finished and the court was painted and tidy, he hugged me and whispered, "Dad, I knew you could do it." Those words gave me the strength to keep going. It wasn't just about proving myself to others. It was about rebuilding the image I wanted to have of myself. My self-esteem, previously shattered, was slowly rebuilding itself. Of course, not everything changed at once. There were seeds of resistance. Some whispers still surfaced, glances that avoided a handshake, but even these bitter signs began to fade. Instead of harboring resentment, I use my energy to plan, to teach others how to fix things, to form small groups of residents who could take on simple maintenance tasks. I transformed rejection into mobilization. The turnaround wasn't revenge, it was recognition of the work. Society, slow, sometimes hypocritical, showed that it can also bow to sincere effort. What I did was simple. I let my actions speak for themselves. And when those actions resulted in something concrete that protected children and improved the environment, the label that suffocated me began to lose its power. Finally, something unexpected happened. The mother, who once shouted, "Ex-con," approached me. She didn't come with accusations. She asked a practical question about my volunteer schedule, and when I explained, she mumbled a barely audible, "Thank you." It was a small, almost shy gesture, but for me it was symbolic. The city was beginning to accept me as I chose to be now, not for who I was yesterday. The turning point was, at its core, a series of small acts that proved one simple thing. People change when they have the chance to show they've changed. And more importantly, those small changes gave me the courage I needed for what was to come, a confrontation that would test everything I'd rebuilt. Life has a curious way of confronting us with our own ghosts. I could already feel things changing, that the community was beginning to see me differently, but the real test was yet to come. And when it arrived, it gave me no time to think, only to act. It was a typical morning at school. I was there early, helping to organize the newly renovated library. Children were coming and going, teachers were getting ready for class, and my son was proud to see me involved. The sun was shining through the large windows, and there was a sense of normalcy I hadn't felt in a long time, until chaos began. Suddenly, the alarm went off. A shrill sound cut through the air, making everyone cover their ears. Within seconds, I heard screams coming from the main hallway. Dark smoke began to fill the classrooms. Children panicked, running in different directions. Teachers shouted orders, trying to keep everyone calm, but panic took over. Someone shouted, "Fire!" The kitchen, which had already experienced problems before, was on fire. The smoke spread quickly, thick and suffocating. I saw teachers trying to organize the children, but they were lost, unprepared to deal with it. The crowd ran in disarray, the danger increasing by the second. That's when I felt something inside me awaken. It wasn't heroic courage, it was survival instinct, mixed with the experience of someone who had faced extreme situations. I knew that if there wasn't organization, this could turn into a tragedy. I ran into the hallway without a second thought. My son, terrified, tried to follow me, but I grabbed his shoulders and said firmly, "Stay here, I'll come back for you." And I entered the smoke. Screams echoed from all sides. Some children were trapped in a room whose lock had jammed. I kicked the door with all my might until it gave way. I rushed in, coughing, the smoke burning my eyes, and pulled the little ones out. One of them, crying, grabbed my neck and refused to let go. I carried him in my arms and yelled for the others to follow. I ran down the hall, directing the teachers. "Get everyone to the outside patio. Keep the windows open. Don't let anyone back in." My voice, so often ignored, was heard in that moment. It no longer mattered whether I was an ex-convict or not. There, in that moment, I was simply someone who knew what to do. Meanwhile, the fire raged. The ceiling creaked, and the heat was unbearable. I knew there were more children trapped in another wing. Without hesitation, I advanced. I found 2 girls locked in the bathroom, crying in fear. I shouldered the door open and pulled them both out by the arms, nearly dragging them down the smoke-filled hallway. The firefighters hadn't arrived yet. I knew every minute was crucial. I went back once more to check the classrooms. I saw a boy trying to get his backpack, paralyzed by the smoke. I ran to him, threw the backpack away and carried him outside. When I finally reached the exit, coughing and with a sore throat, there were dozens of parents and teachers outside, staring in shock. I was still carrying 2 children. The silence that fell was absolute. Those same looks that had previously condemned me now looked at me with something different: surprise, gratitude, respect. I didn't need words to understand. They were seeing with their own eyes who I truly was. But the confrontation was not over yet. Among the crowd, I saw the mother who had once shouted "ex-convict" in front of everyone. She was there, desperate, crying. Her son had still not been found. When she saw me, she ran to me, begging, "Please help my boy, he's still in there." In that instant, every insult she'd ever thrown at me came flooding back. I could have said no, I could have turned my back, but I looked into her eyes and realized this wasn't about us. It was about a child in danger. Without hesitation, I re-entered the burning building. The smoke was now almost unbearable. The ceiling threatened to collapse. I screamed the boy's name, my voice echoing down the hallway. I heard a faint cry coming from a room at the back. I ran there, kicked the door open, and found the boy huddled under the table. I scooped him up in my arms, held him close, and ran for the exit. When I emerged, sweaty, coughing, and with the boy in my arms, the crowd erupted in applause. The boy ran into his mother's arms, who, in tears, looked at me as never before. She said nothing, but her gaze held a mixture of regret and gratitude. In that moment, the confrontation was won. Not with violence, not with anger, but with courage and humanity. I didn't need to shout to prove who I was. My actions spoke for me. And for the first time since leaving prison, I felt like I wasn't just a survivor trying to fit in. I was a man who could rise above the label. I was a father. I was a worker. I was someone capable of saving lives. That morning when I pulled the children out of the smoke and delivered the boy into the arms of the mother who condemned me most, something inside me changed forever. But it wasn't just inside me. It was also within that community. I, Michael, the man who for months had been called a criminal, was now seen through different eyes. Not because the past had disappeared, but because the present had spoken louder. When the firefighters finally brought the fire under control and the danger had passed, everyone was gathered in the courtyard. The children were coughing, some were crying, but they were alive. Parents in shock hugged their children as if it were the last time. And in the midst of that chaos, I was there, sweaty, with a sore throat, but standing. It was then that I heard something I never imagined. The school principal, who had so often eyed me warily, came over, put her hand on my shoulder, and said loudly for all to hear, "If it weren't for Michael, we would be telling a different story today." Those words echoed in the silence. Parents, teachers, students, everyone turned their eyes to me. There was no immediate applause, no shouts. There was something deeper, recognition. That collective gaze, which until then had been judgmental, now carried respect. My son ran to me and hugged me tightly. He whispered in my ear, "Dad, I always knew you were a hero." At that moment, it no longer mattered what others thought. I already had the recognition that mattered most, his. But fate wanted to give me something greater. In the following days, the news spread, first throughout the city, then through the local press. "Ex-convict saves dozens from school fire" was the headline. The same people who had previously whispered behind my back now came up to me to thank me. I walked the streets and received greetings. People who had previously crossed the sidewalk now looked me in the eye. The irony was both bitter and sweet. I had to risk my life for them to see me as human, but I held no grudge. I just thought that somehow that experience had wiped the dust off my name. One episode particularly struck me. I was at the market buying bread and milk when I ran into the mother who had insulted me at the meeting months earlier. She stood before me, her eyes welling up, and it took her a few seconds to speak. Finally, she said, I was wrong about you. Forgive me." It wasn't easy to hear. Part of me wanted to respond, "I don't need your forgiveness." But I looked at her face and remembered her desperation when her son was trapped in the fire. I remembered how she'd begged for help. I took a deep breath and simply said, "The important thing is that your son is okay." She cried and for the first time reached out her hand to me. I squeezed it. In that simple gesture, there was something greater than personal reconciliation. There was poetic justice. The cycle of humiliation and judgment was being broken. My son, in turn, walked proudly beside me. At school, the teasing stopped. The classmates who had previously called him the criminal's son now called him the hero's son. I didn't need that title, but knowing he could finally hold his head high without shame was the greatest victory I could achieve. Over time, my life began to take a new direction. The supervisor from the company who had dismissed me due to parental pressure contacted me again. He said he'd seen the article in the newspaper, that he recognized my work, and that he wanted to give me another chance. I could have rejected him. I could have thrown the humiliation I'd suffered in his face. But I accepted, not because I needed to prove anything to him, but because that job was an important step in my reconstruction. I went back to work with dignity, with a signed contract, and with the feeling that I was conquering every piece of my life back. The community center also grew stronger. People who previously saw it as a place for ex-convicts now respected it as a space for transformation. Alan asked me to coordinate new volunteers, and I began helping others who were in the same place I was. Broken, disillusioned, trying to get back on their feet. I told them, "It will hurt. They will call you things you are no longer. But if you keep walking, one day they will have to see you for what you do, not for what you were." It was as if I had found a new purpose, to transform my pain into a bridge for others to cross. And deep down, this was the greatest poetic revenge of all. Because those who had humiliated me, who had rejected me, who had pointed fingers and called my son a criminal's son, now had to face the truth. I had risen above it all. And I hadn't just survived. I had become a reference, an example, even for those who condemned me most. The criminal stamp would never completely disappear from the records, but for that town, for that school, for my son, I had rewritten the meaning of my story. They learned, perhaps too late, that no one should be defined solely by the worst mistake they ever made. And deep down, I understood something even greater. My redemption didn't come just from the fire I extinguished that day. It came from every tear I shed, every humiliation I endured, every step I kept taking when there seemed no way out. It was this journey that gave me the strength to be who I am today. Today, when I look back, it's hard to believe everything that happened. It feels like I lived several lives within one. The boy who grew up in a poor neighborhood, the man who fell to the temptations of easy money, the prisoner who spent years behind bars, the father humiliated at a school assembly, and finally, the man who managed to rise up amid the flames to save children. There were so many falls, so many wounds, so many times when I thought I had no strength left, but each step brought me here. It wasn't a straight path. It wasn't pretty. It was crooked, full of pain, but also full of lessons I never would have learned otherwise. Today, I understand that my life cannot be defined solely by the mistakes I've made. Of course, they are a part of me. I don't run from my past. I don't hide what I did. But I also don't let it be the only thing that defines me, because I am more than my mistakes. I am what I learned from them. I am what I choose to do now. My son, he's the reason for everything. I remember well the day I heard him say that maybe it would be better if I didn't show up at school anymore. It destroyed me inside. But seeing the transformation in his eyes after the fire was like being reborn. Today, when he looks at me, he doesn't see shame. He sees pride. He sees a father who failed, but who got back up, who fought, who never gave up on him. There is no greater recognition than this. The curious thing is that for a long time, I fought for society to accept me. I wanted to prove to everyone that I was no longer the criminal. But in the end, I realized that this fight wasn't the most important. What really mattered was proving to myself and to my son that I could be different. The rest, sooner or later, came naturally. Life isn't perfect yet. There are still suspicious looks. There are still those who whisper behind your back. And that's okay. I've learned not to waste energy trying to change everyone's mind. I spend my energy building a new life, building trust, setting examples. Because that's what lasts. Today, I work with dignity. I have my routine, my salary, and I still help out at the community center. There, I meet others like me, men and women who bear scars that society insists on throwing in their faces. And I tell my story, not to boast, but to show that there is a way out, that no matter how far life has pushed you, there's always a ladder, however small, for you to climb back up. I teach them something I learned firsthand. You are not what you did wrong. You are what you decide to do with the time you have left. The image that comes to mind most when I think about all this is the school gate. For a long time, that gate was a place of pain for me. There I was judged. There my son was humiliated. There I felt the crushing weight of the past. But it was also there, at that same gate, that I walked out carrying children in my arms, that I saw my son smile with pride, that I felt the community change. The same gate that was once a symbol of shame has become a symbol of redemption. I remember one day, after everything, standing alone at that gate, one night after a meeting at the community center. The school was empty, silent. I stood there, staring inside, remembering every scene, the screams, the humiliation, the smoke, the fire, my son's embrace. I took a deep breath, closed my eyes, and smiled. Because I realized that door was no longer the same. It now represented victory. And at that moment, I decided I would no longer carry the word criminal as a condemnation. Yes, it's part of my story, but it's also part of my overcoming. Today, when someone calls me that, it doesn't hurt anymore. Because I know who I am. I'm Michael, father, worker, survivor, and above all, someone who learned that true freedom isn't just about getting out of jail. True freedom is when you look at yourself and understand that you're no longer a prisoner of the past. And when I closed the school door that day, I felt for the first time that I was truly free.